Welcome back and Happy New Year. It's another episode of the Swamp247 Podcast. My name is Jacob Rudner alongside Swamp247 recruiting analyst Blake Alderman. A little bit of a New Year's break for us, Blake, but now we're back and in an extremely busy recruiting time for the Florida Gators and teams across the country. Full swing transfer portal season is where we're at. Florida has gotten involved. Florida has 4 commitments from the transfer portal so far. Former Wisconsin quarterback Graham Mertz, former Ohio State linebacker Terada Mitchell, former Memphis defensive lineman Cameron Jackson, and former Louisville defensive lineman Caleb Banks. And we're here to talk about those guys. So I guess first, Blake, give me your thoughts overall on that group of 4 transfers who I just mentioned. Some things that you're noticing. Do those guys address the needs that Florida has? What are your general takeaways with these guys?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, you see the defensive linemen, Caleb Banks, Cameron Jackson, excuse me. I've done that like twice now, even before we recorded the show. I keep trying to make him the high school signing for Florida, but Cameron Jackson from Memphis, they're guys with some size. When Caleb Banks took that official visit to Florida back in December, measured in at 6'7", 310. He's a guy that can clearly has the length to move between defensive end and defensive tackle. Which, if you look roster-wise, defensive tackle is one of those areas where Florida really needed to shore things up. And I think even entering Cameron Jackson into that fold there, he's a guy that's listed on Memphis's website, as being a 340-pound guy. So, if you're looking for some depth there, and a guy that, in Jackson that's coming off of his best year at Memphis this past season, those are guys that are, they're going to be thrown into the fire. Whenever you recruit these guys out of the portal, you're looking for some guys that can come in there with some experience, someone that can shore up some of those areas to help you along as you transition some of these guys you've signed in high school to fill those types of holes. So, I think that whenever you see those two guys, it's pretty evident that, defensive tackle is an area where they want to shore some things up. And I mean, that's pretty obvious from seeing Florida's defensive line last year. They really, kind of suffered as far as not having the depth on the interior part of the defensive line. So, those are guys that, can kind of help bridge the gap between that heavy defensive line class that they signed from the high school ranks in 2023. With Mitchell, I think that he's the guy to me that Florida has that seems kind of boom or bust. He's coming in as a highly regarded high school recruit, was a top 50 guy on 247 Sports composite rankings, had offers from, a guy that could take your entire family to, to college with all the offers he had. Sure. So I think that he's one that, you've seen him obviously have the snaps. He's been a captain at Ohio State. So you're getting someone that has experience. He has some leadership there in an area from, linebacker where, Florida's losing Ventrell Miller. They're losing Amari Burney. They're returning some guys, that you've seen some flashes from them at linebacker, maybe some guys that don't still have the, ideal, game reps under their belt as far as their linebacker room goes. And even, from the high school ranks, they've only signed Jaden Robinson out of that, that high school linebacker class, which was an area where they really felt like they needed to shore things up. So I do like the fact that they're bringing in some of these guys through the transfer portal like Mitchell. Didn't play much in the 2022 season, dealing with an undisclosed injury, just in general, that's kind of where I get more into the boomer bust part of him, because he's either a guy that's going to come in and he's going to flash in your defensive system. He's going to be a leader in a room. He's going to help coach up some of these younger guys that maybe don't have the snaps, like I said. So, ideally you want him to come in and you really want him to, to fill that gap and, be that guy at that Mike linebacker. He's a beefy guy. He's coming in with some size. He fits that Mike linebacker role that they want to a T. I kind of see his game being fairly comparable to Ventrell Miller, former linebacker for Florida, even a guy like David Reese, to where you see the size, you see him, being someone that you think could fill in those run gaps as far as being a Mike linebacker. Could he be a little bit of a liability in coverage? I think that's where my big question is, and I think that's where there's some comparisons to, Ventrell Miller and David Reese, because those were guys that were great in run coverage. And Ventrell Miller had a great season for Florida last year. So, but, he was a little bit of a liability in coverage. He just wasn't a guy that really moved. So with Mitchell, you want to have a guy that, can shore up the run there, really be a leader there, and, we'll see what happens there. With Mertz, Florida's obviously, Anthony Richardson's gone off to the NFL draft. He's declared for the NFL draft. We've seen Jack Miller in the Las Vegas Bowl there. Didn't have the greatest game in Florida spring game. Granted, that was the second team offense going against the first team defense, so you can kind of expect that. But you just haven't really seen, A, the experience from him, and B, what you have seen, there's enough cause of concern to where it's understood of why Florida went to the transfer portal for a quarterback. Sure. So, with Mertz, I think there's even some boomer bust to him as well. You look at the stats that he's had when he was at Wisconsin. He turned the ball over quite a bit, had some struggles with interceptions, but he was still able to do some good things, and ideally you would think that, Florida offensive wise, having the athletes that are accessible to, the University of Florida, whether it be, recruiting in the state of Georgia, recruiting in the state of Florida, that, there's going to be a step up as far as the caliber of athlete you would have there. So that's another guy where I'm interested to see how those two guys fit in. They'll obviously be there for the spring. They'll get the playbook under their belt. So, you could see the areas where Florida really wanted to address. And to me, that's what the portal should be used for, is kind of shoring up those areas to where you don't have the depth. And, quarterback, linebacker, defensive line, I feel like are, areas of concern that we've talked about from a depth standpoint on this podcast until the cows come home. So, those are guys where you could see where they wanted to address. And so far, so good as far as getting those guys committed. Caleb Banks is actually already on campus. He enrolled on Thursday. Well, not enrolled because technically the spring semester hasn't started yet. So he moved in. That's the better way to put it. So he's already there in Gainesville. The other guys will be trickling in over the course of this weekend. The spring semester at Florida starts on January 9th. So, these guys, and the high school guys will be there on Sunday, all the guys that are early enrolling at Florida. So these guys are going to get a chance to get in the system. They're going to get a chance to learn in spring football, get acclimated to everything, get their nose in the playbook, get in the weight room for the offseason. So it's an exciting time for Florida, and it's definitely a busy week as far as the transfer portal.
I think I'd be remiss to not point out that one thing that you mentioned, and I agree with it, is that it's a solid group of 4 players who they have already committed to the program. But I think one thing that is worth mention is that I don't know that any of these 4 guys are what I would call surefire players, surefire additions. Sure. I think Cameron Jackson
That's fair to say.
Is probably the closest thing to that. I like Cameron Jackson a lot. I think he fits this defense's identity and what it's trying to be, pretty much to a T. The others, you mentioned Mitchell is kind of a boomer bust guy. You say that he's only played 4 games in the last year, lost his captainship at Ohio State, so an interesting situation there. You have a guy in Caleb Banks who doesn't have a lot of playing experience under his belt. I would also say that there's a degree to which he's kind of an interesting fit for this defense. I think that he's going to have to kind of mold his game in order to work in it ideally. And then you have a guy like Graham Mertz, who is absolutely experienced. But again, I don't know how well he fits the scheme. I think that this is an offense that relies upon having a rushing quarterback or a quarterback with the ability to make the unannounced play with his legs. Mertz has no history of doing that. And it's not like Mertz has only been playing college football for a year and there's part of his skill set that hasn't really been unlocked. I think it's pretty safe to say at this point that this is not a mobile quarterback. This is a guy who is a pocket passer. He has several seasons under his belt where he finished the year with negative rushing yards. Florida's coming off a season in which its quarterback was a phenomenal running guy and somebody who contributed quite heavily on the ground. This is a style change, especially if Mertz is going to take over the job. And I think that it is fair at this point to have questions about whether or not the guys that are being brought in are truly surefire cures to the problems the team has on its depth chart. And I'll be interested, like you, to see exactly how these guys perform in the spring and how they contribute down the line. Because, again, I don't think it is a sure thing. I think that there are some things that need to be shown here and also some areas that need to continue to be shored up, especially those linebacker spots and even on the defensive line, because I do think that a guy like Terada Mitchell, for example, could be a very big contributing player, somebody who is brought in to play a real role. However, that might not look the way it needs to look if the depth around him isn't adequate. I think that they need to pad some of these positions in order to allow some of these players to really shine in the roles that the team intends them to shine in. So work to do, I think, in the transfer portal. And with that being said, they're doing it. There are visitors on campus for Florida in the final weekend of this first transfer window. Transfers cannot take visits after January 8th. And they're in that like high school dead period, transfer only time. So Florida has the opportunity to really focus on Division I talent. And here are the list of people who are on campus right now. Deuce Spurlock, a linebacker from Michigan. Al Walcott, a defensive back from Baylor. Michael Masua, an offensive lineman from Baylor as well. John Campbell, an offensive lineman from Miami. And Gilbert Edmond, an edge prospect from South Carolina who was on Florida's campus but is no longer, as he has a couple other visits lined up as well. Cameron Jackson, who we just talked about, also took an official visit. These are some interesting names as well. I think it kind of falls into the category for some of them of guys who have something to show and haven't necessarily shown it. Others have some starting experience. I will go to you, Blake, though. What is your analysis of this group? Are these players, A, in contention to end up at Florida, and B, if they do, are they more surefire additions? Are they also kind of in that question mark wait and see category? How do you view these guys?
Yeah, I think the two Baylor guys, Walcott and Mazuka, I think those are two guys that, really stand out to me as guys that would be upgrades, from what you've seen there. Obviously, I say upgrade of what you've got now, because I don't think there's it's very hard to upgrade, an Osiris Torrance, who's an offensive guard for Florida last year, to anybody. That's a guy that's coming in that was a consensus, All-American, in a year, this guy's getting a brick outside of Ben Hill Griffin Stadium. So I think you're still keeping the trend of having a very good offensive guard that's coming to your program through the transfer portal. And, he's coming in with a ton of experience as far as Baylor. He was, has played a lot of games for them at that offensive guard spot. That really kind of shores up, having a guy that, you're losing a guy that has a lot of experience and has been very great through his college career. And you're replacing him with another guy who's got a lot of experience, has been really good for his his college career. So I really like the fit that Micah has for that offense. He's a guy that, is a mean, nasty offensive lineman. He's a big guy. So, that's exactly what the doctor ordered there when Florida's still trying to piece together this offensive line. You lose an Ethan White. I think it's an upgrade to bring in a guy like Micah. That's, to me, that's an instant upgrade type of guy that you're replacing one for a guy that's another really good player. Walcott, to me, is an interesting player. And, and I say that because whether you want to box him in as a safety or you want to play him at nickel or star, what Florida calls it on their defense, those are both areas to where he could be an impact guy for them. You lose Trevez Johnson through the NCAA transfer portal, who was Florida's star for, most of last season, if not all of last season. And you're bringing in a guy that has played very well at the star position, who he's very physical as far as coming downhill and playing that run game. He's been great, in passing coverage, maybe not the stats that show that, having only a handful of interceptions there, in a 3-year career at Baylor. But, one of those interceptions that he had through his career in the 2021 season is the Sugar Bowl record for the longest interception return, which I believe was 96 yards or something to that nature. So you've got a guy that can attack the ball, very physical there. And I think that there are a lot of similarities between what Baylor did on defense to what Florida wants to do on defense. So I do understand the scheme fit and the similarities there, to where you've got a guy that, is coming in as a 1-year guy that's kind of a Band-Aid type of player that you've got there, which is what Florida really needs at the star position or even at safety. Even if you want to move Walcott at safety, you're replacing, Trey Dean and Rashad Torrance, and expected to have some of these younger guys that have been on Florida's roster that maybe don't have a ton of experience, but you like what you've seen from them. You've seen those flashes. If you want to play Walcott at star, great. He can make an impact there, bridge the gap of some of these guys that Florida signed in their hefty class of defensive backs in the 2023 cycle. Or if you wanted to throw him in at safety and try some of these other guys out at star, it gives you some options. And I think that's something good for Florida, because whether you play him at safety, whether you play him at star, you've got some guys that you can move around him. And, and again, if you get him there in the spring, and that's going to give you time to tinker with some of these guys to figure out what your best lineup is there. So to me, Walcott is very interesting of a player there for Florida, because I think he can be a big upgrade for them at the star position, considering that right now Florida could very well, play a guy that doesn't have a lot of snaps there, or you could be bringing out, let's just play what if here. If you're throwing out a Sharif Denson, who's a true freshman at that star position that Florida signed in the 2023 cycle. So I think it's good for Florida. I don't think in general, you don't want to throw these freshmen out, at the earlier part of the season. That's something where, unless they just completely are lights out in spring, that's right. Really kind of the only disclaimer there. But, you've got a guy that can be in your system as you bring along some of these other younger guys that you're expecting to probably be thrown into the fire early. So I think that would be a really good addition for Florida. And I think it's a much needed one there, whether you play him at star or safety. I think the best fit for him is more than likely star, just from what you've seen on tape from him at Baylor. But, he's an interesting one. Deuce Spurlock, to me, is almost more so like signing a high school kid as opposed to signing a transfer portal type of guy. And I say that because he was a 2022 signee for Michigan at the linebacker position. Limited snaps as far as his first year at Michigan, kind of expected whenever you've got a team like Michigan that traditionally plays a lot of these older guys, and they're, usually a veteran-led type of team. There's always, some exceptions to that rule, but for a guy like Spurlock, you're getting someone that to me is more like a high school signing rather, a guy that's going to be a 1-year guy, because I believe he's got 3 years left of eligibility left there to play at the college level.
Spurlock should have 4
You're
years
right.
of eligibility, actually.
Yes, you're correct. Sorry. You're 4 years left there. So again, that's more like a high school guy. But he does have his feet wet as far as how to practice like a college player, how to adapt to life as a college player, all these things. Right. That's still a bit of a learning curve for some of these guys once they get from high school to college. So I don't think I'm maybe as familiar with him as a player, not someone that I was very familiar with as far as when he was a high school recruit, just because he wasn't really on Florida's radar at the time. Really doesn't have a lot of the snaps that you've seen at Michigan. I know he's played in the Hawaii game that Michigan played last year. Not a game that I watched, not any tape that I've reviewed on him. So that's one that I'm maybe not too sure on as far as maybe the impact he makes or anything like that. But as far as relative to Florida's roster, you're bringing in another linebacker. You're bringing in a guy, again, position of need. You've only signed one guy at the high school level. You can mix him in with some of these other guys that are on Florida's roster that maybe don't have all the game snaps in there. You can coach him up. He's a guy that you're going to be able to really – he's going to be one of your guys. You're going to have him so long in the system if he was to commit to Florida and he was to stick through things. And, the transfer portal is interesting because guys can go in and out. You never know how the future is going to hold. But let's just say, it's in a world he comes to Florida – things work out. He finishes his career there. He's a guy that you're going to be able to put your own fingerprint on. You're going to be able to coach him up. He's going to learn your system, and you're going to be able to develop him through the future. So I think ideally for Florida, you only signed one guy at the high school level. Well, having a guy like Spurlock is almost like having a high school guy there. So he's a guy that you don't have to worry about for 1 year. And then it's like, oh man, well, we got to, carry this over to the 2024 cycle as far as the need carries over. I think that's the plus there. John Campbell, to me, is a guy that has played offensive tackle. He's played offensive guard, whether it's left tackle, right tackle. And I think for Florida, one of those areas that I've said that, as far as from high school recruiting, and beyond, and this even goes past to when Billy Napier's staff was hired. Even the former staff at Florida struggled at bringing in those offensive tackle guys consistently. Yeah. And I think that's where Campbell comes into play. You lose a Michael Tarquin, who is in and out of being Florida starting right tackle through the 2022 season. I think ideally, if you land a guy like John Campbell, you can wait and see how things work out as far as if he's going to be the left tackle, he's going to be the right tackle. But you've got a guy in Austin Barber at Florida that's, really shown he's a really high level of play in the 2022 season. So you've got two guys that you can kind of experiment there in the spring with of who's going to be the left tackle and who's going to be the right tackle. So I think that John Campbell has the snaps. He has struggled through his college career. You watch, just the grades that he's had, as far as Pro Football Focus and all those types of things. I mean, he's not a guy that has really blown it out of the water on as far as what he's done on tape at the college level, but he's got experience. And if there's one thing that Darnell Stapleton and Rob Sale have been able to show this past season was that they are high on development. Florida had a great offensive line, was an area where they really did a really good job coaching. You've got 5 guys in total between on-field coaches and off-field coaches that are there to directing to coach offensive linemen. So if you've got a guy that maybe is a little raw in some areas, even though that he has been in college for a long time, or maybe has some areas to clean up, I think this staff has done a good job and has shown so far in a limited capacity of how long they've been at Florida that they are good at, coaching these guys up and raising their ceiling up even higher. Oh, yeah. So I'm interested to see what a guy like Campbell could do with some coaching from Florida.
I would even say, to your point about the offensive line, I think that Rob Sale and Darnell Stapleton have done enough to buy themselves the grace of fans who should probably understand that the history goes back beyond 1 year at Florida. They had a great year here for sure, but you look back at what they did at Louisiana. I believe off the top of my head, there are 5 offensive linemen in the history of Louisiana's football program who have been drafted. 3 of them were coached by either Rob Sale or Darnell Stapleton at some point over the last 4 years when they were over there. And that says a lot. And it should also and be noted that these are guys who probably could have easily played at the SEC level and just went under recruited. So their ability to identify talent, I think, is proven over time. Their ability to develop that talent is proven over time. You want to add a guy like Osiris Torrance even to the list. It went to Louisiana, flourished over there, came to Florida, like you said, and he's going to get a brick and be immortalized basically at the University of Florida for 12 games of work. And it just goes to show, I think, that this is a duo of coaches who, at a minimum, are very, very talented developers, are very talented identifiers of players. And so I think that they do deserve the grace of the fan base where you might look at a guy like John Campbell and go, well, he has struggled. Why is this our target at tackle after losing both starting tackles? Obviously, like you said, you return Austin Barber, but still the majority of the starts went to Michael Tarquin at the position, and he is no longer on the roster. Do I understand that a guy like John Campbell might not be the most eye candy type transfer target? Sure. But do I also think that this is a coaching staff that has proven its ability to find and develop offensive line talent? Absolutely. So patience at that position, I think, is important. And then to your point at linebacker, extremely thin room right now. Florida has just 5 scholarship players on its roster, including Terada Mitchell, at the inside linebacker position, one of whom is a true freshman in Jaden Robinson. Scooby Williams and Shamar James are making up a significant portion of this room, and they are not terribly experienced players. So not only does it not return a lot of depth, but it is not returning many players who have seen a lot of snaps. So a guy like Mitchell ends up probably being very important. A guy like Spurlock probably ends up being very important. One guy I'm going to circle back to here, though, Blake, is Gilbert Edmond, the edge from South Carolina. His visit is in the rearview mirror. So as we record this on Friday, January 6th at about 2:00 in the afternoon, he has already come and gone through Gainesville and has visits set up. I believe it's LSU and Ole Miss. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Correct. Yep.
Give me your thoughts on him. I think a really interesting player at a position of dire need for the Gators. Just 3 scholarship edge players, outside linebackers on the roster at the moment. Brenton Cox was obviously the starter for the majority of the games at the position. He was dismissed in October. Lloyd Summerall is no longer on the team, nor is Chief Borders. So the room is thin. And here's a guy who has a ton of experience, played basically more snaps than almost anybody at his position in the 2022 season. But the results weren't great. And you talk about grades with a guy like John Campbell. I'd say that Gilbert Edmond kind of falls into the same category. But if you're following who's in the portal, edge is a thin position. Not a lot of great options there at the moment. And this is a guy who has SEC playing experience. So what are your thoughts on him, and where might Florida stand in that recruitment?
He's coming off of an official visit to Florida State. That was on Wednesday when he came right out of the gate when the window for official visitors opened for portal guys. So he was there at Florida State, Florida on Thursday, left today to head towards LSU, like you said, and then he should be spending his Saturday at Ole Miss for a visit. So he's fitting in a lot of visits into a short period of time, so things are pretty rushed for him, and that's typically how things have looked as far as portal guys this weekend, just because you've got so many of these guys fitting in these quick day and a half type visits. So Florida State was the team that I've heard probably the most about as far as, his recruitment, or his second recruitment, if you will, when it comes to Edmond, but, was recruited to South Carolina by Mike Peterson, Florida's current outside linebackers coach. I think another guy that probably isn't talked about a lot as far as their ties to the Fort Pierce area where Edmond is from is Jamar Chaney, Florida's off-field staffer there, who helps with the defense and, is big into the recruiting part of, defensive guys for Florida behind the scenes. So, those two guys have some ties to him. I think it's kind of hard to say right now. I know that Florida felt the visit went well. I think they understand that there's a gauntlet of visits that are coming up for him as far as, hitting the road and seeing all these places in a short amount of time. Florida State is probably the team that I've heard the most about there. And I think that is probably due in part to, him have at least being somewhat recruited by Mike Norvell when he was first hired at Florida State. Maybe not the longest time of withstanding, relationships there. So I think that has something to do with that. I know there's NIL as a factor for him as well. So I think Florida State has checked the box off there as well. I haven't really gotten a lot of intel out of his visit other than knowing that it went well, just because it did just end today. And he is taking a lot of these visits in a short amount of time. Right. But I think that the ties that he has to a guy like Mike Peterson and Jamar Chaney, I think those are notable enough, so we'll see how things go out for him there, but again, like you said, they're short on bodies at that jack linebacker position. So yes. Is he a guy that really jumps out to me that should be penciled into a starting role at that position? I think that's probably wait and see how the spring goes. I think he's probably very similar to what you've seen at Antoine Powell-Ryland, just from, maybe not so much as the snaps that he's received, but just, I guess, how I see him as a player and the impact he's been able to make there. So I think at the very least, if you can get a guy that eventually turns into a starter at that position, great. Then you've done your job there at the portal. But at the very least, he's a guy that brings depth to a position that direly needs that.
I think it's an interesting conversation. You you segue it for us perfectly here to kind of wrap up the show. There are several positions on this roster that are quite thin right now. Inside linebacker is still one of them, even though they landed a transfer there and a high school commit. Outside linebacker is probably the most dire on the roster. Offensive line at just 14 scholarship players is quite thin. Wide receiver even is at 10. Ricky Pearsall is still kind of on the fence of do I go pro or not, and based on our reporting. And again, I would take this opportunity to encourage you to go check out our coverage over at swamp247.com, where we have a lot more information than we can cover in one podcast episode. We've heard that Ricky Pearsall is leaning towards a professional career and calling it quits after 1 year at Florida, or not quits, but moving on from Florida after just one season. And the professional prospects for him are looking pretty good. That position becomes exceptionally thin if that's the case. I would say running back could probably use one more body at just 3 scholarship players, although that room is pretty solid overall. You look at the roster, Blake, and it's hard to deny that they need a lot of help from the transfer portal, and they only have 4 guys committed to the program to show for it. Could that list grow in the near future? Absolutely. But in your opinion, what really needs to happen here over the next couple weeks, months, to put this roster in a position where it can improve upon its first season under Billy Napier?
Well, first and foremost, I think with the spring semester, really kind of getting really close to us here as far as getting these guys in there now to go through spring football. I think, an edge defender, if you can shake out, I don't know how defensive line would really roll with them. If you got 2 now, obviously there's no guys on their radar for visiting this weekend with it being so close to the spring semester. I think obviously linebacker, edge defender, offensive tackle, maybe even offensive line in general, but I think offensive tackle to me is the one that jumps out the most of, what you really need to hit on there. I think that those are probably the positions, linebacker, edge, those are the ones that really jump out to me the most as far as getting numbers right for your spring football season. But in general, even past that, because there's going to be another window for guys to enter the NCAA transfer portal when the spring rolls around. I don't know that there's really a spot on the roster in general for Florida that you look at. Maybe corner, is maybe one, but I don't know, man. I just think in general, you look at the roster from top to bottom. I don't know that there's really a position where Florida's like, okay, we're good there. I feel like if they can upgrade the position or add someone in there, whether they be a depth piece, whether they be someone there that's a really good player that can compete for starting time. I just don't know that there's really a position on the roster that jumps out to me to where Florida would be like, nah, we're good.
Right. Yeah,
so I guess that's just where I'm at with that. I just don't think that Florida, if they can upgrade any position, you do it, but I think that sure, there are some positions that need it more than others.
And I would say this, there's plenty of room to be able to do that. Florida's sitting at 77 total scholarships as of the recording of this podcast. They can have 85 on their roster. Also should be noted that there are no limits on the high school side, so you can take more than 25 as long as you stay under that overall 85 cap. And there are a couple targets, or at least one target, for Florida who is on the radar, possible commitment at the offensive line position, which is important. But again, like you said, you don't want to be in a spot where you're throwing freshmen into the fire in 2023. You probably want to try and fill those spots with Division I transfers, Power 5 transfers who pass your evaluation test. So with that being said, there's work to do, and we will have it covered. So make sure you're keeping it locked over on at swamp247.com. We're constantly posting information over there. And if you really want the full experience, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button, join us on the message boards, and get access to our VIP content, where we will give you, really everything that we can report on, which we can't get to necessarily in a podcast episode. And regardless, make sure you go on and head on over to the site and check out what we have to offer. Also, if you are listening to this on YouTube, we appreciate you and ask that you like and subscribe. Let us know what you think in the comment section. We do read them. And that's pretty much going to do it for this episode of the Swamp 247 podcast. And we will see you on our next show.